So welcome to the Lozadra Museum virtually. My name is Sarah. I am the educator here at the Lozadra Museum, and it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Kate Martin, who is going to be giving her second version of this presentation. The first was in person, and if you were not able to join us in person, we are glad that you're able to join us virtually. She is been a longtime member at the Lozadra Museum and also worked as a spectroscopist. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yes. All right. I was sitting here thinking of how to say that correctly. All right. So I am going to go ahead and turn it over to Kate. And so I'll go ahead and take it away, Kate.
Thank you, Sarah. Zoom is still a little uncertain for me sometimes, so please signal in some fashion if you cannot hear me or if anything is going awry. And let me start with the share screen. And here we go. All right, well, first, thank you all for coming, as it were, to my talk this afternoon. It's this morning I had an actual audience that was, I could actually talk to. So now I'm going to have a kind of a hallucinatory audience, I guess. The alchemy itself has a rather dismal reputation, much of it well-deserved. And 20 years ago, if you had talked to a science historian and suggested that alchemy and chemistry were related, you would have been just laughed out of the house. More recent scholarship by some science historians has suggested that there's more to alchemy than just mysticism and chicanery, though. And now a lot of science historians do believe that alchemy, in fact, is a forerunner of modern chemistry. Not everyone agrees, but that is a widespread thinking now. In this talk, I'm going to give a very abbreviated history of Western alchemy, and especially with an eye towards this question of how alchemy and chemistry are related. And, all right. So many of you probably have a rather cynical view of alchemy. Many do. Cynicism towards alchemy is certainly not a new phenomenon. This engraving of a monkey alchemist displays all of the contempt that many people have had for alchemy throughout the ages. I am not a science historian, but there are plenty of science historians, and I'm relying very much on all of the work that they've done. In particular, Lawrence Principe at Johns Hopkins University and William Newman at Indiana University have gone back to a lot of the original alchemical texts and tried to decipher them, which is not an easy task because these texts are often couched in very obscure language with a lot of codes and secrecy and so forth. And they've done their best to try and understand what the alchemists were up to. Lawrence Principe has gone so far as to try and reproduce a lot of the alchemical recipes in his own laboratory. As far as I know, he has not been successful in making the Philosopher's Stone or making gold. So if you were hoping for a tutorial, you will not get one today. The goals of alchemy were primarily transmutation of base metals into gold. That was the overriding impetus for Western alchemy, was to make gold. There was another aspect to alchemy, and that was the betterment of human health. And that became more important in the 16th century or so. Today, I'm only speaking of Western alchemy. Both China and India have very long traditions of their own in alchemy that predate Western alchemy. Those traditions are more focused on human health, but I'm not referring to those today. The fascination with gold goes back for a very long way, and thinkers from Aristophanes to Mr. T have noted just how wonderful this metal is. And gold, it's shiny, it's pretty, it doesn't corrode. It's rare. It's estimated to be about 5 parts per billion of the Earth's crust. but not so crazy rare that you couldn't ever know what it was. So gold is thought to be the perfect metal. I mean, it's just lovely stuff. It's something that people have wanted throughout millennia. The origins of Western alchemy are thought to lie in the Greco-Roman Egyptian world of the couple of centuries before and after the birth of Christ. So you have here in this world, you've got the Egyptians with their skills in metallurgy, in glass blowing, textiles, dyes, and so forth. You have the Greeks with their emphasis on philosophy. You have the Romans with their engineering skills in metallurgy and ore refinery and so forth. So the merger of these traditions, the Greek and the Roman and the Egyptian, really form the basis for Western alchemy. Now, in this world, the center of intellectual life was the city of Alexandria in the north of Egypt. And this is where scholars flocked from all over the Mediterranean and beyond to exchange ideas and discuss and learn and so forth. And so the Library of Alexandria held maybe 1 million scrolls on various subjects, from jurisprudence to rhetoric, but also alchemy. Alchemy was a big subject here. I want to briefly talk about Aristotle. I mean, Aristotle was not an alchemist, but Aristotle's views really influenced alchemy for over a millennium. So Aristotle subscribed to the view that matter is composed of 4 elements. This was, I think, originally from Empedocles. So there's air, earth, water, fire. What Aristotle did is he added to this by saying that each of those elements have elements of, or have properties of hot and cold, wet and dry. And this is very important because this is fundamental to the idea of alchemy, where you can transform one material into another. If everything is made as a compound made out of different parts, you can pull those parts apart and put them back together again, and you wind up with something new. He also talked about a moist exhalation and a dry, smoky exhalation. These would emanate from the center of the earth, rise up, and then condense back down. The moist exhalation would condense into metals, and the dry exhalation would condense into minerals. And again, some of these ideas become incorporated into alchemy. The earliest known alchemist, known to be a real person and not just a fantasy, is Zosimos of Panopolis. Now, Zosimos was a Greek living in Egypt about 300 or so in the Common Era. His goal was transmutation. He wanted to make gold. He also described a lot of practical apparatus for filtration, sublimation, and so forth. He credited a lot of the apparatus that he described to a woman named Mary the Jew. Mary the Jew may have been a real person, but she has never been authenticated as being a real person. Mary the Jew, among the things that she described was this method for gentle heating. So you, instead of putting your pot right on a fire, you could put it in a water bath and you would get gentler, more controlled heating. Today, a lot of kitchens have this piece of equipment. It's called a bain-marie, and it's similar to a double boiler. And so a lot of kitchens today may have some, what could be considered alchemical equipment. Anyway, Zosimos, like so many after him, used very obscure codes and symbols and so forth to describe his work. And all that's left of his work are really fragments of papyrus. And so it's a little bit difficult to really understand exactly what he was doing. But he did have a theory that he based his experimentation on. And his theory was that metals are composed of a body and a spirit, and that you can take the body and the spirit apart. So for example, you could distill off the spirit, take that spirit, contact it with another body, and you would have a new metal. And this is really the fundamental concept behind alchemy, is that you can take apart a metal into its principal components, change those principal components around, recombine them, and have a new metal. And so this is just absolutely fundamental. But of course, the world of the Greeks, Romans, and Egyptians, fell into decline. At the same time, there was the ascendance of the Islamic world, and these Islamic armies marched in different directions, including west, and they conquered much of what had been part of the Roman Empire, including the center of the city of Alexandria. And in this way, the Arab world got a hold of a lot of these Greek texts. So not just alchemy and philosophy, but all of the Greek texts. And they translated a lot of that work into Arabic, which is fortunate for us because, of course, we have that work now for posterity. And one of the greatest of the alchemists of the Islamic world was Jabir. Now, there were a lot of different scholars in the Islamic world. Jabir's focus was on alchemy. He was primarily around the 8th century. He was probably actually more than one individual because there were about 1,000 texts that were attributed to Jabir, and he probably couldn't have written all of them, especially since some of them occurred after his death. But that's alchemy for you. So Jabir is for convenience considered one man, but was actually probably many. He was a big proponent of practical work and getting into the lab and doing experiments. And his most enduring contribution to alchemy was this Mercury sulfur theory of metals. And it goes like this. According to Jabir, all metals are composed of the principles of mercury and sulfur. And those principles can combine underground, different proportions, different purities, and gold is the result of the finest mercury and sulfur in the perfect proportions. So again, you have metals not just as elements that are just what they are, instead you have them as compounds. In this case, mercury and sulfur. So you should be able to pull them apart, purify them, put them back together again, and get a better metal. Well, one thing is wrong with this theory, and that is if you combine mercury and sulfur, you get mercury sulfide, which is cinnabar. It's a nice mineral. If you powder it, you have vermilion pigment. And it's certainly not a metal, nothing like a metal. And in fact, the ancients were well aware of this. They used cinnabar all the time as a source of mercury. But what's really meant here is not something quite so literal. There's the principle of mercury. So the principle of mercury, and there's a lot of different ways that texts describe this, but the one that makes the most sense to me is that it's a liquid-like principle. So mercury itself, of course, is a metal. It's a liquid at room temperature. It's fun. As if you're old enough, you can remember playing with it as a child. It's a very nice little metal. You can have tin and lead, and they're made molten at fairly achievable temperatures. And when molten, they look a lot like mercury. They're silvery metals, and you can not quite as quicksilvery as mercury, but they're kind of nice too. And so you have this idea that metals have this liquid-like characteristic that's associated now in calling it the principle of mercury. And then you have sulfur, which is considered to be a combustible principle. Why sulfur? Well, of the metals known in antiquity, they were either mined as sulfides, such as lead and mercury. Lead is found primarily as the mineral galena, which is a lead sulfide. If you've been to Galena, Illinois, you've seen perhaps the lead mines there. And mercury, of course, is found as the cinnabar, the mercury sulfide. But these other metals, even if they're not found as sulfides, are found in close association with sulfides. So if you're mining these metals and then you roast them, you wind up getting some sulfur dioxide and other sulfurous compounds coming out. So anytime you roast these metals, you have this odor that's associated with sulfur. So it's not illogical to say that sulfur is a component then of these metals. Here's a picture of some sulfide minerals. The Lozadra Museum, of course, has a very extensive collection of minerals for those of you who have been here. Some of them are actually very handsome. Well, over time, by the Middle Ages, the Christian armies of Europe were pushing back against the Islamic world in Spain and Sicily, North Africa, and especially, of course, Jerusalem. There were the Crusades, but other points of contact as well. And so in this way now, Christian Europe gets a hold of all of these texts in Arabic. So that includes the texts that the Arabs had translated from the Greek, and it also includes the original Arabic texts. So what we have is a transfer. You start with the Greco-Roman Egyptian world, transferring over to the Arab Islamic world, and then to medieval Europe. And this is just a very brief overview of European alchemy. The first translation of an alchemical text was by Robert of Chester in 1144. So he's translating from Arabic into Latin. And shortly thereafterwards, there were the condemnations by the church. The church felt that any of this speculative work on alchemy or Aristotle should just be banned. But that didn't last long. The church rethought it and thought it was better just to simply control the narrative. And so they set to work a number of friars to translate works from Arabic into Latin, and other friars to do commentary to make sure that Aristotle, for example, is being consistent with Christian theology. So everything had to be made consistent with the church. But as time goes on, of course, the church loses its strict control over the alchemical texts, and alchemy spreads out further and further among the populace to the non-Latin speakers. More and more people are doing alchemy in Europe. And by the 13th century, you have Pope John the 22nd issuing an edict against alchemy. He wasn't really opposed to alchemy if an alchemist was going to make gold for him, but he was opposed to somebody else making gold, basically. And then time goes on, you get to the Renaissance and humanism. By the 16th century, there's more emphasis on medicinal alchemy, and there's the scientific revolution. And by 1720, there's a real split here, so that the more scientific elements of chemistry, of alchemy, become chemistry, and the occult and mystical elements are still called alchemy, and they persist to this day. There are an enormous number of websites on modern day alchemy. A word about religion here. In the Middle Ages, especially, religion was fully integrated into every aspect of your life. There was no barrier between science and religion. They weren't separate spheres. And religion wasn't something you just did on a Friday or a Saturday or a Sunday. Theories about the world were based on theology. And because the church was so important, religion was so important, alchemists often used allegory and metaphor to enhance this link, to say that alchemy was legitimate because it was close to Christianity, it was similar to Christianity. So in 1652, there was a book, Alchemista Christiana, or something like that. And in there, they described how alchemy is similar to the various rites of the Catholic Church. So that baptism, for example, is compared to the use of water and fire for purification in an alchemical procedure, and so on. And that kind of communication was very popular. So the codes, the allegory, there was a lot of use of Greek and Egyptian mythology, the Kabbalah, the astrology, and so forth. So that makes it very difficult for science historians of today to look back and understand exactly what was going on, because it's a little bit confusing. And in addition, sometimes there was intentional deception. So it's kind of like if I ask for a friend for a recipe and she gives me the recipe, but she leaves out a critical ingredient. That's the kind of thing that alchemists could do as well. They were also highly imaginative sometimes. So, for example, I could have an experiment, try my experiment out, and I don't get the result I get, but I might write down that I did get that result because, I should have gotten that result. So scientific rigor was not a big factor for the alchemists. And in addition to that, there was no standard nomenclature. So the codes and the symbols and so forth used by one alchemist might not always be the same as another. So even honest communication would have had some problems. So an example of the use of obscure codes is Cold's dragon, who creeps in and out of caves. Then you might wonder what that refers to. So you have a recipe that might call for this. Well, that refers to saltpeter, which is potassium nitrate. Now, how do you get Cold dragon who creeps out in and out of caves from saltpeter? Well, the saltpeter crystals grow on the interior of caves, and they are cold to the tongue. So a more poetic mind can come up with Cold dragon who creeps in and out of caves. There was also the widespread use of pseudopigraphy, which is it means I'm using somebody else's name on my work. It's like the inverse of plagiarism. And a couple of reasons you might want to do that would be, first of all, if I write a paper and if I put down Albert Einstein's name on that paper, it's going to get a lot more notice than if I use my own name. More important, I think, was the need for secrecy, because alchemists were often at odds with the church or state authorities who really didn't want somebody else to be able to make gold unless it was for them. So it was a lot safer just to use somebody else's name at that point. And there are a lot of examples in alchemy of this. And one, I'll just use one, and that's Nicholas Flamel. Any of you who have read Harry Potter might remember Nicholas Flamel as a character in a Harry Potter book. And he was a real man. He was a scribe in 14th century Paris. And it wasn't until about 200 years or so after his death that he developed quite a reputation as an alchemist when texts started appearing under his name. Nicholas Flamel was not an alchemist, but he certainly lives in history as one. And then there's, of course, the Philosopher's Stone. Again, Harry Potter fans are going to be very familiar with the Philosopher's Stone. And the idea behind this is that, first of all, metals are growing underground, right? Well, of course, metals aren't growing, but it was certainly thought that metals grow underground, like plants do. And it fits in with Aristotle's idea that all these things are happening underground and growing and changing. There's also Aristotle's idea that nature is always striving for perfection. That means that all of these metals are gradually becoming gold. So lead is simply immature gold. The Philosopher's Stone is a way to accelerate nature's own process. So this isn't even, something that's opposed to nature. This is just moving nature a little bit faster. It's also a way to multiply gold. So you could start out with one gold coin, add your Philosopher's Stone, and voila, maybe you have 10 gold coins now. So it's kind of like seeding the process with a little bit of gold, and you get a lot more gold out. Skepticism towards alchemy was there from the beginning. So in Jabir's time in the Islamic world, there were a lot of discussions about whether transmutation was even possible. And if it was possible, if gold made by transmutation would be equal to real gold. And of course, there was always a lot of concern about fraud. Dante published his Inferno, part of the Commedia, in the year 1317. he placed alchemists in the 8th circle of hell, actually the innermost portion of the 8th circle of hell, with the other falsifiers. One of the figures here in the 8th circle of hell was a man named Capocchio, who had been burned at the stake for being a false alchemist. And apparently Dante and Capocchio were at school together. And one story that I read, and I wouldn't put a lot of stock into the truth of it, but goes that one day in school, Capocchio comes up to Dante and shows him a crucifix that he had drawn on his fingernail. And Dante admired it, and then Capocchio just licked it off, which was very offensive to Dante, who was quite pious. And Dante took him a while, but he got his revenge and he put Capocchio there in the 8th circle. Chaucer also had a chance, he got his licks in. The canon's yeoman tale is about a corrupt canon who swindles people into believing that he can make gold. It's thought to be based on a real story of William de Bromley, who was a chaplain who was on trial for selling fake gold to the mint in London. So these are stories that go on a long time. I'm going to mention 4 fairly prominent alchemists, starting with John of Rubicissa. He was a 14th century French Franciscan friar. At this time, there were these orders of mendicant friars, including the Franciscans, and they came about in opposition to a lot of the luxurious lifestyles of the church hierarchy. This was offensive to many people, so these friars rose up in response to that. John himself was actually a member of the spirituals, so that was a radical sect even within the Franciscans, really radically devoted to poverty. John of Rubicissa, and he was an alchemist. Okay, does that sound a little contradictory? Probably. But for John, there was no contradiction. For John and the other spirituals, the presence of the Antichrist was imminent. And the church needed weapons to fight the Antichrist. So what did they need? They needed gold and they needed health. So John set to work as an alchemist. Now, many of John's fellow spirituals were simply put to the stake because the church hierarchy wasn't too fond of their message of radical poverty. John was fortunate. He spent his life in a series of prisons, but apparently he was able to do a lot of alchemy in those prisons. There was a recipe that he made for making gold for the Philosopher's Stone that involved using highly purified mercury and highly purified sulfur. And in addition, he also introduced a lot of quantitative aspects to this process. So he talked about things like mass balance and so forth, which were really pretty advanced concepts, I think, for the 14th century. Well, needless to say, he was not very successful with making gold, but he also had an effort to try and find an elixir for good health. So he took wine, he distilled it over and over and over again till he got a very high proof alcohol, what he called the aqua vita, water of life, also called burning water because it would support a flame. And unlike just plain old wine, it didn't turn into vinegar. And it also would keep meat from rotting. So if it was going to keep meat from rotting, it should keep our bodies from corrupting, right? And he also introduced a lot of plant extracts into this alcohol. He added minerals, including gold. And of course, this whole idea, this distillation that he was doing was not novel. It had been known really for centuries. Mankind has been after more and more alcohol. But John puts it in more of an alchemical sense, that he saw this alcohol as the quintessence, the 5th essence of wine. And he felt that highly purified element of wine would also be true for blood and other aspects that would lead to good health. Paracelsus was a 16th century Swiss physician. He subscribed to the Mercury sulfur theory of metals, but he also felt that salt was an integral component, but he really wasn't interested in transmutation. He was focused on health. And he saw our bodies as alchemical machines in a lot of ways. So he thought that our body's organs behaved in an alchemical manner, which means that they were just out to separate the pure from the impure. At the time of Paracelsus, the views of Galen, the 2nd century Greek physician, held sway. So Galen's idea, he was the one that thought that ill health was due to an imbalance in the 4 humors of the body. So the blood, the phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, and that you would treat ill health by bloodletting or emetics and things like that. And Paracelsus thought that was all nonsense, and he was very loud in his denunciation of Galen. He's also considered sometimes to be the first toxicologist because he noted that it's dose that makes the poison. So something could be toxic at a very high level, but non-toxic or even beneficial at a lower level. And he saw that there were categories of disease, so that several people could have the same symptoms, same disease, and they should be treated in a similar manner. And he also sought chemical remedies for illness, and he was particularly a proponent of laudanum. But he also had some kind of crazier ideas. He believed that you should treat not just the wound, but also you needed to treat the weapon that made the wound. He subscribed to the doctrine of signatures, which said that you treat an illness with something that resembles the organ that is ill. So if skin is jaundiced, you have to treat it with a yellow pigment. Or if you have skin eruptions, you treat them with plant galls, things like that. And he believed, quite falsely, that you could remove the toxicity from arsenic and so forth. But he had an enormous impact on medicine, and after his time, you were either a Paracelsian or you were a non-Paracelsian. And then we come to John Winthrop the Younger, who was the son of John Winthrop the Older. John Winthrop the Older was a Puritan governor of Massachusetts. John Winthrop the Younger was also a Puritan. He was also an alchemist. And his goal was to establish a community of alchemists in the New World, specifically New London, Connecticut. He obtained a charter for Connecticut and so forth from the king, and he tried to assemble a group of alchemists. He wanted alchemists in the New World because they could provide so much of what the New World needed, explosives and dyes and so forth, and particularly because they had the know-how to exploit the mineral resources of the New World. But some of the alchemists he recruited were not Puritans, and that didn't sit well with the other Puritans. The Native Americans that were around there really didn't want anything to do with this enterprise. There was a lot of infighting among the colonies, and the whole thing fell apart. At this time, I saw an estimate that there were about 50 active alchemists in the New World. So it was not, it didn't have a strong stronghold, but it was here. One thing I really like about Winthrop, though, is that he was a defender of witches. So at this time, of course, witches were frequently brought up before tribunals and sentenced to death, found guilty. And Winthrop, certainly he believed in witches and witchcraft, but because he was an alchemist, he knew that it wasn't all that easy, and so that most of the people that were being brought to trial couldn't possibly have done what they were accused of doing. So together with somebody else, they drew up a set of criteria for what constituted diabolical magic, and thus really raising the bar for what it took to be convicted of witchcraft. That didn't really last long, and it was after his time then when the Salem witch trials came into being and so forth. And lastly, then there's Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton is always considered to be one of the greatest scientific minds of all time. In polls of scientists, he always comes in number 1 or number 2. He formulated the laws of gravity, the laws of motion. He did incredible work to understand the nature of light. He invented calculus. But it's estimated that he may have spent more time in alchemy than he did even on optics, which would be incredible. It's estimated he wrote over 1 million words on the subject of alchemy. You don't hear about this part in school. So when Isaac Newton died, he was president of the Royal Society, and his heirs buried all of Newton's papers that had to do with alchemy. So these didn't come to light until the 1930s, when a lot of those papers came up for auction. One of the people that bought up a lot of Newton's papers was John Maynard Keynes, the economist. And it was at this time then that some of this work, that the fact that Newton had been an alchemist, came to light. So for Isaac Newton, I mean, he was a great scientist. He was an alchemist. He was also a theologian. And for him, there was absolutely no problem in being all three things at once. But really, even before Newton's death, alchemy was falling apart. People were no longer trying to transmute base metals into gold. They'd kind of given up that aspect. So there's more serious scientists among them wanted to be known as serious scientists. At this time, you could go to a university and study. You could study physics and optics and things like that, but you couldn't go and study alchemy because it just wasn't a serious science yet. So the serious people wanted chemistry to really stand on its own as a serious science. And the occult elements are still called alchemy, and they go off on their own. And there's this quite diverse split there. Now, given that alchemists did not make gold, how did they make a living? Well, they had all this wonderful equipment and laboratories, so they could make dyes, perfumes, a lot of medicines and elixirs, and they also could perform a lot of practical metallurgy that was in big demand. Some of them were lucky enough to find sponsors. The Emperor Rudolph II, a 16th century Holy Roman Emperor, invited scores of alchemists to his court. But some had family wealth, and some, of course, turned to fraud. So charlatans were around from the beginnings of alchemy, from everything from just gilding metal, which was kind of dangerous because people did know how to assay gold, to using a crucible with a false bottom. So a crucible is simply the vessel that you use for making your gold. And you could have gold in the false bottom. You could have lead then and your Philosopher's Stone and whatever else. And at the end of your experiment, you could reveal all of this gold. It was a very popular thing to do. And fraud was so widespread that one nobleman, Frederick of Würzburg, actually had an entire gallows reserved just for false alchemists. It was gilded, and on the gibbet he had inscribed, "I once knew how to fix Mercury, and now I am fixed myself." It's a lovely sentiment. And there are numerous variations of this story, and who knows how much truth there is to it, but it suggests that there's some truth to it. It's just such a fun story. And it goes like this. A foreign alchemist comes to town one day, and he invites all of the local alchemists to a lavish banquet. And they come and they're wined and they're dined. And after dinner, then the foreign alchemist offers to do a demonstration of his ability to multiply gold. They're all in favor of this, so all of the alchemists put in some of their gold coins into the pot, and the foreign alchemist, he adds his potions and powders and so forth, sets it over a fire, and then boom, there's a big explosion, smoke everywhere. And by the time the smoke clears, so has that alchemist, and so has that gold. So, alchemy, forerunner of chemistry? Well, on one hand, there was so much of it that was based with a theological underpinning, with theory. There was also a heavy-duty association with the occult, and there was the use of all these codes and symbols, and a great deal of fancifulness. And there was, of course, a lot of fraud. On the other hand, alchemists developed a wide variety of apparatus and techniques, many of which are still in use today. And a lot of alchemists made a very close observation of the natural world. And based on these observations, they built theoretical frameworks, such as the Mercury sulfur theory. And then they performed methodical experiments based on that theory. So yes, I think that altogether, alchemy is a legitimate forerunner of chemistry. It doesn't really matter what I think because the question has already been answered by the Elmhurst Public Library. I went to the library to try and check out some books on alchemy, and I found that all of the alchemy books were shelved with the chemistry books. At first, I was a little bit horrified at this, but then I decided that I would certainly bow to the wisdom of librarians, who are a wise people indeed. So I want to thank Dorothy Asher and Sarah Kurth here at the Lozadro Museum for giving me the opportunity to do this presentation. And I thank you all, and I would be happy to take any questions. I don't really know how to do that, but
That's all right. Thank you so much. All right. Let's start my video and open it up to questions. So if you have questions, feel free to unmute yourself and or you can send them by chat to myself or to Kate. So I'm gonna take a look here and see what we've got. All right. So you should all be able to unmute yourself. If you have a question, please feel free to go ahead and ask. Let's see. Kevin asked, did you play with Mercury as a child?
of course. And if you're trying to imply anything about the consequences, who knows?
I also played with Mercury as a child. So, you know, I know in your presentation earlier today, you said it was more older generations, but I also played with Mercury as a kid. So it is. Is anyone still fooled by fake gold? And actually, I can answer that for you. Yes, a lot of people are still fooled by fake gold, especially here at the Lozadro. We get people who think that they're going to make a lot of money, and although it's usually not gold, it's usually meteorites that people think that they're gonna retire early. And then it looks like Lillian, you have your hand raised. Would you like to go ahead and ask your question? Let's see. Oh, maybe that was a mistake. And then Michelle followed up with the fake gold question. Is it easy to tell if it's fake? And actually, yes. So true gold, pure gold is really soft and pyrite is much harder. So hardness test is the best way. Okay. Oh, Lillian, your hand's back up again.
So in summary, what is the relevance of alchemy in today's world?
Are you referring to historical alchemy or modern day alchemy?
Modern day alchemy.
Modern day alchemy, I think is, although I think there are people who take it very seriously based on the websites I've seen, but it's also a sort of a fun thing. There's something called a Full Metal Alchemist. It's a manga series. So I think it's just a sort of a cultural quirk. It's not really very scientific, I think I would say.
So you would say it doesn't have any applications for modern day uses other than for fun?
To my way of thinking, no, I don't think so. I think it's more of either a fun pastime or a chance for manga comics or something like that.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Kate, I know a question that came up in the first presentation was about the occult and the, if you would mind touching on that again. I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's something I think it's very difficult for the 21st century people to understand the degree to which the occult was just integrated into so much thinking, so that you could be truly scientific and also be firmly enmeshed in the occult at the same time. They just really weren't separated, at least until about the 18th century. I find it very difficult to follow, but there's a lot of texts that are, have a lot of serious science in them from these medieval alchemists, or even later, that are then filled with a lot of fancifulness at the same time. A lot of mythology. Some of the alchemists thought that they would find the key to the Philosopher's Stone buried in these mythological stories. So they would use the stories to describe what they were doing, but they also thought the answer might be in those stories themselves. It's very difficult for me to really try and understand that.
Ezra has asked a question. It's kind of a long one, so bear with me. He says, during the Civil War, the Confederates needed saltpeter for gunpowder. They put out a request for dirt from smokehouse floors. Why would saltpeter be found in 19th century smokehouses?
Potassium nitrate. I find nitrates in a lot of ash, a lot of things that are burnt. A lot of organic material, you're going to find a lot of nitrogen. Maybe there's some potash around. I'm not really sure. And I've never been in a Civil War smokehouse.
Interesting.
But nice to think about, yes. But I think it's nicer if you start thinking about saltpeter as a cold dragon that moves in and out of caves.
So thank you all for joining us. And Kate, thank you for joining us for your second round. Really appreciate it. And everybody have a good rest of your day. And to the mothers out there, happy Mother's Day.
Thank you all very much.